There's been an unfolding story at Houston Methodist Hospital that has been really interesting to track. It involves a number of nurses and healthcare workers at the hospital who have refused to get COVID vaccines. And the hospital itself, back in April of 2021, actually changed its policy saying that, anybody who wants to continue working at the hospital has to get vaccinated against COVID-19. And if they refuse to do that by June 8th, they would be suspended for 2 weeks without pay. And after those 2 weeks, if they continued to not get vaccinated, they would then be fired. And I mean, right off the top, what was interesting about this whole story for me was the fact that, you have nurses and healthcare workers who, were a huge part of this entire, COVID narrative over the last little while, directly treating patients, being considered heroes and all that sort of stuff. And then suddenly here, you now have a hospital saying, well, but if you're not going to follow our rules, you're essentially dispensable to us. We're just going to get rid of you and fire you. And interestingly, the sort of pushback from the 170 or so nurses and healthcare workers at the hospital who refused to get vaccines, the pushback came from the feeling that, they didn't feel comfortable with the science, with the study that had been done so far on these vaccines. They have been, if you've been following what's been going on outside of mainstream media, there's a lot of concern to be had with these vaccines in the sense that, you have, whether it's the heart inflammation story that's been emerging, whether it's, younger people just dropping dead right after the vaccine, you have heart attacks that are happening. There's a lot of stuff going on with this vaccine that's just not being reported enough by mainstream media, to the entire world. What's happening is a lot of people, a lot of healthcare workers are having to go to colleagues or practicing doctors or, alternative and independent media, and they're having to find out about what's going on in the situation. And that particular piece is going to play into what I'm going to talk about in just a second as to why this whole situation is so important. But, here these nurses and healthcare workers were saying, nope, we're going to push back on this situation. We don't feel comfortable. We want to see more study. We want to know what's going to happen in the long term. Let's wait for clinical trials to be completed. Which of course is going to lead into 2022, because part of these vaccine studies was they wanted to look at, what is going on within people up to 2 years after they've been vaccinated. And this is why the FDA has not fully approved these vaccines. A lot of people are feeling just because the FDA approved these for emergency use that these vaccines are safe and effective, which, they're verifiably not. They don't know for sure that these vaccines are safe and effective. This has sort of just been a series of words that have been passed down based on some initial interim studies that have looked at, hey, how is this affecting people who are getting the vaccine? And we do know that based on digging through enough of those studies that there was potentially a lot of dishonesty too from the various vaccine manufacturers on these particular vaccines. So essentially what happened here at Methodist, just to give a little bit more context here, Houston Methodist did give, so there's about 25,000 employees at Methodist who did get the vaccine. And so you only have about 170 that are left saying, no, we don't want it. But they did give a couple of exemptions to 285 employees who came with religious or medical reasons saying, I don't know if it's a good idea for me to get this vaccine. Houston Methodist was okay with that. They also gave 332 deferrals to people who had situations like they were pregnant, so on and so forth. So they were accepting of various healthcare workers that had what they considered to be, good reason, good medical reason or religious reason. But for people who simply believed that the science wasn't settled on this issue, Houston Methodist did not allow that to be a viable reason for these people to not get vaccinated. So here's a quote from CEO of the hospital, Mark Boom. He said, "It is unfortunate that today's milestone of Houston Methodist becoming the safest hospital system in the country is being overshadowed by a few disgruntled employees." And, this is kind of where the idea of disgruntled and getting into this is something that I think is very offhanded. It's an offhanded remark, and I'm going to discuss why that's offhanded in a second. But one of the things that did come up here that I noticed a lot of people asking with regards to this emergent story is that you have in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott, he signed into law a law that basically prohibits any businesses operating in Texas from requiring vaccine passports or any vaccine information. And a lot of people felt that this law would apply to this situation. Unfortunately, it doesn't for the healthcare workers, because this law only applies to customers of these businesses, not actual employees itself. So essentially the businesses can operate as they choose, as they're free to do, basically saying that, look, if you want to work with us, you got to get the vaccine. And this goes back to the discussion of mandating vaccines, right? It's been long felt back since 2020 that a lot of people were worried about the idea that governments would essentially mandate vaccines. And of course, governments said, no, we're not going to do that. But, there was a lot of feeling like, hey, are governments usually transparent? Are they usually honest? A lot of people have been losing a lot of faith and trust in institutions over the last little while. And I think that's rightly so in a lot of ways. But they were pushing back on this idea that vaccines wouldn't become mandatory, saying, yeah, well, they might find other ways to make people get vaccines or deny them of particular services. And we're seeing that here, right? We're seeing that, businesses still have, free will to basically say, look, if you want to work for us, then you have to do this. And there's nothing really there protecting, the citizens to have this feeling or this belief saying, like, maybe I just don't want to get vaccinated with a vaccine that's not entirely proven yet. One of the employees, Jennifer Bridges, who has been kind of leading the charge against saying, hey, we don't think this is right, and rallying up a number of the healthcare workers to come together. She actually filed a lawsuit against the hospital, claiming that this is against our rights. It's against our ability to. We should be able to work. We should be able to do what we need to do. We've been here forever. A lot of us thought we were going to retire here. This is our home, and now all of a sudden we're being let go, fired because we're not getting a vaccine. Like, this doesn't seem right. So she took it to court. Unfortunately, as of June 12th, U.S. District Judge Lynn Hughes sent down a ruling that basically upheld the hospital's decision, saying that the mandate of inoculations for its employees was consistent with public policy. So essentially now, Jennifer Bridges and the rest of the healthcare workers, who now have a lot of public support behind them, are going to be appealing this decision, and they're willing to take this as far as the Supreme Court if they have to. I think this is a big case, and the reason why this is a big case is because this is not just happening in Houston or in Texas right now. This is also happening in Maryland. It's happening in Washington, D.C., where more hospitals are seeking to sort of make their hospital extremely safe, and thus are forcing their employees to get vaccinated. So this is going to be a much wider spread issue, and I think whatever happens here could actually set the tone, specifically in the United States, for legally what might be able to be possible from private companies. And of course, whatever happens, in one country too, can sometimes become a cultural precedent for what happens in another country. So I think this is a really big story, but I wanted to dive back real quick to the discussion of the disgruntled employees. So, here again, I want to bring forth what I said at the beginning too. It's like, nurses and healthcare workers who have been on the front line. I mean, they've been called heroes. They've been called, all these, important, what they've been playing to society for the past while here has been a very important role. And I would argue that even prior to COVID, they've been an extremely important role to society in general. And, here we are just saying, well, they're so long as they toe the line, so long as they're doing what we want them to do, they're okay. They're heroes. They're great. But the moment they say, well, hold on a second, in my medical opinion and in my own looking at the research that's available, the independent research is available that may not be pushed into the mainstream eye, I'm not comfortable with this vaccine. And suddenly they're kicked to the curb like, well, these people are a joke. They're disgruntled employees. I was kind of amazed by that. And I was kind of amazed by, because what this does is when a CEO comes out and says that, and this is published in a number of mainstream news outlets, this quotation saying like, look, this is what this guy said about these employees. What it does is it starts to shift public opinion to really looking at these nurses and these healthcare workers as potentially not really having a case in this issue. That we've been hearing for such a long time that the vaccine safety and efficacy of these COVID-19 vaccines is basically an open and shut case. And it's just been being repeated over and over again. There's obviously a massive agenda going on that looks at, hey, let's take any particular treatment that could be out there, whether it's ivermectin, whether it's hydroxychloroquine, and let's kind of push it to the side and let's just favor this vaccine campaign. And I wouldn't be shocked at all. I mean, I have no way of proving this right now, but I wouldn't be shocked at all if, a CEO of a major hospital in the United States, I mean, Houston's a very big city. And so, obviously this hospital is a very important part of the community, and somebody who's running that hospital would be an important figure in that community. And, I wouldn't be surprised at all if, hey, make sure you kind of continue this vaccine narrative, continue this sort of vaccine, situation if you want to have a good standing in the pharmaceutical community moving forward for the rest of your career. And this is the kind of stuff that unfortunately I don't think enough of this type of conversation is happening in our mainstream society right now. We're seeing a lot of pushback from doctors on these vaccines. There was actually recently a formal citizen petition signed by 27 doctors that was submitted to the opinion section of the British Medical Journal. There was an article that followed the submitting of a letter that was signed by these 27 doctors, and they were essentially urging the FDA to delay any approval of these vaccines, given the fact that they're worried about what's going to be happening with this spike protein. We're seeing a lot of evidence emerging that shows that the spike protein does not stay in the injection site as assumed. There's a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to the spike protein. So these doctors they're looking at this data constantly, and they're talking about it, and they're just not making it into mainstream media. But the pushback is there. Essentially, the summary of the letter that they wrote to the FDA urging them to delay, it sort of breaks down into a simple statement that encompasses all of it. It says, the message of our petition is slow down and get the science right. There is no legitimate reason to hurry to grant a license to a coronavirus vaccine. We believe the existing evidence base, both pre and post authorization, is simply not mature enough at this point to adequately judge whether clinical benefits outweigh the risks in all populations. So essentially what they're saying here is, look, for some people, maybe it's okay. For others, we're seeing that it's not okay, that there's a great risk, especially in younger people. These vaccines are showing a lot of issues, and these younger people happen to be people that are not dying of COVID at all. In fact, a lot of them are remaining asymptomatic, which means they're most likely not even spreading the disease. And the challenge that we've been seeing here in this whole COVID narrative over the past while is that most of the stuff that I've been sharing in this particular video, the facts we've been going off of, the stuff that's been happening, a lot of people in the mainstream don't know about this stuff, right? So people who are paying attention to mainstream media, they don't understand that these vaccines are not irrefutably, safe and effective. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of healthcare professionals that are not conspiracy theorists that have a lot of questions about this stuff. And what we're seeing right now is as people's rights and freedoms to even work starts coming under threat, we're seeing that there's basically a bulldozer effect happening where it's like, well, who cares? You might have been very valuable to us before, but you're not towing the mainstream narrative. Boom, we're willing to throw you to the curb. And this is going to continue. If they're willing to do it to the nurses and the healthcare workers, they're going to do it to everybody. So this is something that's a very serious situation, and from the standpoint that we have to do something about it, right? There has to be some conversation. There has to be bringing to light, bringing to awareness this particular thing. Obviously, some people view this sort of thing as negative, right? It's like, oh, don't focus on the negative things or the bad things happening in society. Look at the wins. Look at the people that are helping each other out there. The challenge is that's a great thing to do. Unfortunately, that only goes so far. When you're seeing our world operate off of bad, traumatized, potentially thinking, right? Authoritarian level thinking, we have to do something about that, because if we don't, we're basically going to get into a situation in our society where we've arrived at conclusions that make absolutely no logical or scientific sense, which we're kind of doing that right now with COVID. And we're going to be in a world where there's surveillance everywhere, there's authoritarian rule everywhere, and we're going to wonder how we got there. And it's happening right in front of us. And there's a large portion of people that are saying, hey, you know what? Let's just stop for a second. Let's take a breath and let's look at what's going on. And we don't have to jump to any conclusions. We don't have to call each other names. We don't have to flip out. But we need to have meaningful dialogue, and we need to see where the mainstream is sort of misleading people into thinking that all of these discussions are open and shut cases, because they're absolutely not. And it's just time that we really start coming together and bridging that gap and having these discussions more openly. And I think this Houston Methodist case is going to be a very pivotal case in understanding, where things are going to move forward in the future. Thanks so much for watching this video. As you can probably imagine, censorship and demonetization has made things incredibly difficult for independent media to survive. We basically rely solely on you to make sure we keep doing what we're doing. If you want to support our work and support this important mission as well, consider becoming a CE member. Basically, you get access to a whole bunch of different member benefits that we have. You can check out the link in the description to become a CE member and learn more about the benefits, and of course, support this work. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you next time.